Hey, welcome along. In the internet age, when I wake up each morning and I look at my inbox before I've had my first cup of coffee, it takes me about, I have to read something 2 or 3 times to figure out whether it's real or not. And this came over the transom the other morning, and it did turn out to be real. Many of you who've seen me down under in Australia will know that I've been happy to share a stage with Andrew Bolt in Melbourne many times, in part because Andrew Bolt fell afoul of the same alleged hate speech legislation down under as I fell afoul of in Canada. And it's a disgraceful law. I managed to get rid of the one with the help of doughty comrades in Canada, Section 13. The Australians still have to get rid of Section 18. But Andrew Bolt is a respected columnist. He's, I believe, Australia's most read columnist, and he has a television show on Sky Australia. And he was at a book launch for Steve Cates down under a couple of days ago, and he was attacked by Antifa activists. That stands for supposedly anti-fascist. I don't know whether you say Antifa or Antifa. I don't care either. And nor do they. They don't stop long enough to introduce themselves. They tend to just come up to you and beat you up. And this is what happened in Australia, in Melbourne. Broad daylight, Melbourne, which used to be the most genteel city in Oz. And in broad daylight, Andrew Bolt leaves a book launch and is set upon by masked thugs purporting to be from Antifa. He gave as good as he got. He gave better than he got. Take a look.
Wandering down a Melbourne street, Andrew Bolt unaware of an imminent assault. A woman asks for a selfie when a masked man throws a cup full of liquid and glitter, dousing the News Limited columnist. Almost instantly, the broadcaster retaliates with a haymaker. Tables tumble and another masked man joins in. A third offender stands back taking photos of the fracas. One falls to the ground and receives a kick to the groin. It's then the trio turn on their heels.
Yeah, that's pretty good. You know, in America they say, don't take a knife to a gunfight. But those of us in the writing trade say, don't take a knife to a columnist fight. Because a columnist has been spending his time with semicolons and subordinate clauses all day long. And by the end of the day, he's itching to punch your lights out. And Andrew saw off those 3 thugs from Antifa, and that's the way every columnist should react when so-called anti-fascists approach him. And it's interesting to me because let's deal with the so-called anti-fascist thing. If you're the guy in a mask beating up someone at a book launch, you're the fascist. Because in the old days, that's what fascists did. The Nazis were the ones who didn't like books. The guys who wrote the books were the anti-Nazis, were the anti-fascists. So if you're in masked garb setting upon people coming out of a book launch, you're the fascist. Now this is part of a mini trend, I would say, because just a couple of weeks ago, Robert Spencer, who runs the Jihad Watch website, was poisoned after a speech in Iceland. The speech was very well received, and afterwards, as is traditional, he went for dinner to have a bit of food and a drink and unwind. And someone who disagrees with Robert Spencer intentionally poisoned him. He spent the night in a hospital. They slipped a cocktail of Ritalin and ecstasy into his drink, and it made him sufficiently ill that he had to go to the hospital in Reykjavik overnight. By the way, when you get to a certain age, the effect some of these combinations will have on you is unknown. Amongst my modest entourage, for example, a cocktail of Ritalin and ecstasy would kill at least one of them. So it's not a small thing. And in fact, attempted murder is what it is. So as I said, that happened to Robert Spencer. Charles Murray wrote a controversial book called The Bell Curve. But Charles Murray is nobody's idea of an extreme right-winger. He dislikes Donald Trump. He supports gay marriage. But he came to give a speech at Middlebury College in Vermont, and again, thugs prevented that speech. And the liberal woman professor who'd invited him, again, wound up going to hospital for concussion. And again, I just want to make the point here. You're not an anti-fascist if you're beating up female professors. If you're beating up women professors and putting them in the hospital, you're the fascist. You're the fascist. So we seem to have, that's 3 examples I've just plucked out. And as for us old Fleet Street hands, 3 is a trend. Where the left's glamorization of violence seems to be having real-world effect. And again, we're not talking here about equal responses. We're talking about somebody who gives a speech, somebody who writes a book, somebody who writes newspaper columns. And we have people who disagree with books and disagree with speeches and disagree with the newspaper columns. And instead of writing a book of their own or making a speech of their own or penning an editorial of their own, they put on a black mask and they beat you up. And this little trend seems to be accelerating. I want to make another point here too. I said at the time of the Charlie Hebdo killings in France, where again, these guys had written cartoons, supposedly disrespecting the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the reaction of those who dislike those cartoons is not to do cartoons of their own, but to kick open the door of Charlie Hebdo and kill the people who did the cartoons. So we don't have here proportionate responses. We have people who write and draw and people who kill. And the pen is mightier than the sword is a very nice line, but not when so many people are prepared to use the sword that the guys who use pens are getting increasingly nervous about getting out the pen. And that is the situation we find ourselves in right at the moment. And I said the left, the Western left, is actually on the same continuum as the Charlie Hebdo killers. They're both in the shut up business. They're both increasingly groups who, rather than win the debate, want to end the debate by chopping off your head or poisoning you or attacking you in the street, or sending you to hospital for concussion. So the debate can't take place, because you're in hospital, or you're lying on the sidewalk in broad daylight in Melbourne, or you're in Reykjavik having your stomach pumped. The left doesn't want to win the debate, they want to end the debate. And that puts them on the same continuum as the Charlie Hebdo guys. I want to make 2 further points about this accelerating trend. And this is why I'm opposed to laws like Section 13 in Canada, which I'm pleased to say that the Parliament of Canada repealed, and Section 18, which Her Majesty's deplorably squishy government in Australia, under both Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, has not got around to repealing, that the whole concept of hate speech denormalizes and dehumanizes people. That the label, in effect, incentivizes what has happened to people like Andrew Bolt and to Robert Spencer and to Charles Murray and others, when you have these kinds of laws. it moves people into a category. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, for example, Robert Spencer was banned from entry into the United Kingdom. I won't go into details about that. I've objected to it in the past. Basically, the British Home Office drew up a list of prohibited persons. And as is the way, most of the people they wanted to prohibit were called Mohammed. And they needed a couple of non-Mohammeds on the list. So to balance it out, they decided to make Robert Spencer, who's a serious scholar of Islam, one of the counterweights to all the zillions of Mohammeds they were trying to keep out. And when the Conservative government came in, interestingly, Theresa May kept that ban in place quite disgracefully. Mrs. May is part of the problem. In other words, she helps denormalize somebody like Robert Spencer. So that, in a sense, he's someone that you don't have to have an argument with, you don't have to have a discussion with, you don't have to have a debate with. Mrs. May has already said this man is beyond the pale. So what's the big deal about poisoning him? Likewise, Andrew Bolt. Andrew Bolt gets prosecuted under Section 18, disgraceful hate speech law. So that law, the Australian human rights apparatus, has again denormalised Andrew Bolt and said, no, this isn't someone you need to have a debate with. You don't need to have a better argument with. We can label him. We can criminalise his opinions. So again, you've put him on a continuum. You've put him in a category where you don't have to win the argument. The Australian state has, in a sense, licensed the shortcutting of the argument, and that too is on the same continuum as eventually beating him up in the street in broad daylight in Melbourne, or attempting to beat him up, because, as I said, Andrew fought back spectacularly, and that's what's going to happen when you come after any of us in the writing trade. So that's another reason to be wary of all this safe space talk, the hate speech talk, because what you're encouraging, I don't think it's coincidental that there's a link between people who attract the attention of the hate speech laws and the human rights commissions and all this other garbage, who then find themselves on the receiving end of intentional poisoning in Reykjavik restaurants, or street attacks in Melbourne, or, for example, what happened to Charles Murray's host at Middlebury College in Vermont. This is a disgusting trend, and it needs to be stamped out. And I used to think that the left was all talk, for the most part, that, Generation Snowflake are a pretty feeble lot, and they're not actually up to beating you up in the street. But things have been getting worse. And one day they're actually going to kill someone. Again, you get to a certain age and you're a fit middle-aged fella and you're just walking around, but somebody throws a punch at you and you fall to the sidewalk and you land at the wrong angle and boom, you're in a coma and you're dead. And that's going to happen in one of these attacks that these savages are doing. So it's not a small thing. And the seduction and the appeal and the glamorization of violence on the left is getting worse. A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed James Mitchell, the man who waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for the United States government at Guantanamo and a couple of other places as well. And he got to know Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the big-time jihadists very well. And there's a fascinating moment that he told me about where he asks Khalid Sheikh Mohammed whether it was difficult to behead Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street journalist that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed decapitated in Pakistan 15 years ago. And what he meant, of course, is it difficult for one man to slice off the head of another man? But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed didn't take it as that. He took it as a technical question, and he answered, oh no, you just have to make sure that your scimitar's properly sharpened, and you don't want to be trying it with a rusty blade, and it's important to go in at this point of the neck. That, in other words, psyching yourself up to chop another guy's head off isn't difficult. And he takes it as read that whichever side you're on in this current struggle, a guy should be able to chop the head off his enemy. And so he just answered it as a kind of technical question. No, you just got to make sure you have the right kind of scimitar, come in at a certain point, and you can slice the guy's head off. And I always thought, you know, the left isn't really man enough to do that. And then I look at this, but they'd like to think they were. And that's what, when I look at this Kathy Griffin thing, she's standing there for some photoshopped photo shoot, I think, judging from the look of it, the photo shoot where she's holding up the severed head of Donald Trump. And what it tells you is that it's kind of a turn-on. The idea of the severed head is a turn-on to the left. They're not quite there yet, but the idea of standing there with Donald Trump's severed head turns them on. It gives them that frisson of excitement. The same frisson that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed got when he slices off heads. The same frisson of excitement that the ISIS guys get when they slice off heads. And if you look at the current production of Julius Caesar, Shakespeare in the Park, that you can see in New York City right now, where Julius Caesar is made up to look like Trump. So it's Julius Trump. Shakespeare in the Park. All kinds of middle-class New Yorkers are going to see this production and loving it. And it ends, as you know, in Shakespeare's play, you know what happens to Julius Caesar? He ends up getting stabbed to death. Except this time it's Donald Trump, and they all stab the Donald Trump figure, and he's all bleeding and dying in front of you. And it's great, isn't it great to pay Broadway prices to see Donald Trump stabbed to death? Isn't it great to see Kathy Griffin swinging around Donald Trump's decapitated head? And as I said, I thought the left doesn't quite have the guts to do it. Say what you like about these ISIS guys, but they like slicing off heads, and they're happy to slice off heads. But something odd is going on here, something deeply disturbing. When a newspaper columnist is attacked in the street in broad daylight, when a man who gives a speech is deliberately poisoned in the restaurant afterwards, when a liberal professor in Vermont is beaten up and sent to hospital because she invited someone to give a speech to her students, take part in a debate, the left is moving closer and closer and closer to the reality of Kathy Griffin's photo shoot, where you're standing there with the severed head. This is not a healthy trend. If you don't want to have the debate, you're the fascist. If you're wearing a mask and beating up people at a book launch, you're the fascist. If you're sending a female professor to hospital, you're the fascists. I want to end with a quote from a French philosopher. Don't all mock and hoot and jeer. This French philosopher, for once, is on the right side of things. Alain Finkielkraut said in 2005, the lofty idea of the war on racism is gradually turning into a hideously false ideology. And this anti-racism will be for the 21st century what communism was for the 20th century, a source of violence. We are seeing it on the streets of Melbourne, on the streets of Reykjavik, and even in rural Middlebury in the middle of Vermont, that so-called anti-racists, anti-fascists have become, as Alain Finkielkraut says, a source of violence and a hideously false ideology. See you next time.